I think we'll get started. Well, thank you, everyone. Welcome, and thank you for coming to today's first Precious Metals Work Group meeting. I am Marlo Oakes, State Treasurer of Utah, and I appreciate everybody's taking time out of your busy schedules to be here and sharing your expertise and insights with us. We're particularly honored to have some special guests. Unfortunately, two of them are hopefully on the way, Kevin Freeman and Brian Summers. But we've also have Luke Groman online with us. They'll be presenting to us today. In addition to Luke, we've got Brian Summers of the Utah Mining Association, and then Kevin Freeman, whose plane was delayed and he landed in Salt Lake Airport, about 15 minutes ago or so. Making his way here to the Capitol. Representative Ireby, would you like to say a few words before we go around and introduce everybody?
Yeah, thank you very much. This just echo the thanks that Marlo has extended, and this has been a long road. We've been working since 2011. I remember the bill that we ran my very first session, holding up a little coin like this as we did the bill eliminating the sales tax and kicking some of those things off. But the script just keeps coming our direction on the need to look at how we deal in payment systems and sound money and those sorts of things. So very grateful to have everyone's insight and experience as we kind of learn our way through and look at the next steps in the legislative work that we do.
Great. Well, thank you. Well, we provided bios of both the presenters and committee members so we can minimize the time needed for introductions. Having said that, let's go around the room and on Zoom, and we'll briefly introduce everybody. Just go ahead and state your name and if you're with any particular organization. I've already gone. Why don't you go ahead?
Yeah, State Representative, District 39, kind of the southwest part of the Salt Lake Valley. And I was first elected in 2010 and had a little vacation for a couple of years and then back, and just grateful to be here.
Great.
Sophia DeCaro.
My former colleague in the House that the governor stole away.
Sophia DeCaro, I'm the Executive Director of the Governor's Office of Planning and Budget. Served a term in the House of Representatives with Ken Ireby here, Representative Ireby, and spent some time in investment advisory firm doing compliance as well. And taught public budgeting and finance for some time at the U. But it's a great honor to be invited to participate in this work group, and appreciate being part of it. Thank you.
Dan Burton, I'm with the Utah Attorney General's Office. I'm General Counsel over there, and I work closely with the legislature and other intergovernmental organizations doing policy. I'm excited to learn what we are going to do here today.
Right. Out.
Howard Headley from the Utah Bankers Association.
Great, welcome.
Brittany Griffin from the Treasurer's Office.
Brian Summers, Utah Mining Association.
Hugh Hannison, CEO of a local tech company.
Gary Crittenden. I'm a reformed banker, I guess, if I think the best way to put it. So I grew up in Utah, spent most of my career in New York and Boston, but call this home.
Great, welcome. And Andy, just in time. Go ahead and introduce yourself, name and organization, and, and then we'll go online. Great. Great to have you, Randy. Thank you. Glad you're able to find us. All right, let's go online to our Zoom folks. Luke, why don't you go ahead? Since you'll be presenting today, just go ahead and give us your name and where you're from.
Yeah, Luke Groman, founder of FFTT, and I am in Cleveland, Ohio.
Great. And let's see, Christian.
Yes, hi, Christian Chalak, Senator Mike Lee's office in Washington, D.C.
Excellent. Okay, and who else is on the community? Okay, Joseph, where's Joseph?
Hi there,
Yeah,
I'm Joseph. Actually, Joe. I should probably get a little less formal with my name on Zoom, so call me Joe. I am with the World Gold Council. I'm joining at the request of Neil Froneman, Sylvania Stillwater CEO. He is our board chairman at the World Gold Council, and he's asked us to step in because we've got a lot to offer in terms of insights, data, research. So happy to be here and thanks for allowing me to join the session today. I'm based in New York, by the way.
Perfect. Let's see, and all right, and then let's get the other folks on here. Jason?
Yeah, I'm Jason Gardner. I'm the Director of Legislative Affairs at the Tax Commission.
Oh, wonderful, okay. And Jason Cousins.
Hi, yes, yeah, Jason Cousins. I'm the founder and CEO of Glint, which is the first platform in the world to enable physical gold as everyday money with the Glint app and MasterCard.
Great, and Jake?
I'm Jake Glenn. I'm a policy advisor for the Utah House.
Wonderful, and then we have, is it Cynthia?
This is Cynthia Maya. I'm the community outreach specialist with the Utah State Tax Commission, and I work alongside Jason Gardner.
Oh, great, okay, wonderful. Welcome, and then, let's see, Jason Nilsson.
The audio's not working, but Jason is with the treasurer's office.
Okay, and then Adam. Oh, for some reason.
Adam, we're not hearing you
Yeah,
either.
I'm hearing you for some reason.
How about now?
There we go.
All right. Adam Taggart, founder and host of Thoughtful Money. It's a fairly sizable financial media platform. I interview experts in money in the markets like Luke, like Joe. So fun to see those familiar faces here. I've known Ken for over a decade. Very happy to be here. I'm based in Northern California.
All right, excellent. Well, welcome. And Brittany's going to be monitoring the chat. So if there are any comments or questions that come up, she'll alert us. As you are aware, the legislature passed HB 348 this last session, allowing the treasurer to invest up to 10% of our rainy day funds in precious metals. It also requires my office to conduct a study analyzing the role of precious metals in augmenting, stabilizing, and ensuring the economic security and prosperity of the state, the families and residents of the state, and businesses in the state, and then report back to the Revenue and Taxation Interim Committee this fall with recommendations for legislation. To complete the second mandate of this legislation, we have formed a work group to assist with the study, and I appreciate all of your willingness to serve in this capacity. This is the first of 5 meetings where this group will convene between now and the October interim session. During these meetings, we will hear from a variety of experts to explore the topic and drill down on the problems we are trying to solve, potential legislative solutions, and any challenges stemming from those solutions. So you have the agenda today. I'm not going to belabor the agenda for the meeting. We also, I'm going to skip kind of covering the future meetings, but we'll send that out to all of you, the topic, and feel free to provide us feedback of things that you think maybe we missed in future meetings. With that, I'm going to let Representative Ivory take a couple of minutes, and then we'll launch into our next item.
Thank you, Treasurer Oaks. Adam, it's great to see you. You know, we started down this road, like you said, more than a decade ago. We were looking at the fact that at the time it was 35% of our state revenue. Number one source of revenue was federally sourced funds, and looking at the risk and what that might look like. And we had actually Adam and Chris Martinson come out and do some risk analysis and seminars that we had back then, and continued to work on contingency planning and how do we deal with this, the risk, the contingency that so much of our budget is not really within our control, that we have federally sourced funds. And I don't know if anybody's read the newspaper lately. There's some issues with the nature of our federal partner in its bookkeeping and finances. I've got, as I was getting ready for the meeting, I came across a resolution that the U.S. Senate passed unanimously, March 24th. It's resolution 600. And it's a resolution recognizing the national debt as a threat to national security. And they go through and they just lay out all of the issues that bring us here, the things we need to be concerned about, that as a state, how do we make sure we can take care of our people? And, you know, they talk about, as of January 2024, the total public debt is $34 trillion. The interest alone in 2023 was $660 billion in just the interest for 2023 and increasing. They talk about the per capita amount of debt and per taxpayer, and they spell out that the deficit in 2023 was 1.7 trillion. And then they talk about the trust funds going to zero in 2031, the Federal Hospital Insurance Trust Fund and the Old Age Survivor Insurance Trust Fund and Disability Trust Fund depleting in 2034. But then they point out something that I think is really critical to what we're doing here. In the resolution that the US Senate passed unanimously, they point out that China and the European Union are developing alternative payment systems to weaken the dominant position of the United States dollar as a reserve currency. And we see things with the BRICS, the Brazil, Russia, India, China, South Africa doing the same thing, actively looking to pull away from the dollar. And the questions that we ask in the risk analysis is, how do we prepare for those kinds of risks when, particularly in a health and human services context, 70% of that funding for the most vulnerable in Utah is funded by a source that is devaluing at 8 to 10% a year. So I thought it was really instructive that the US Senate was pointing out, not that they can actually then do anything about it. They don't have the political will to do that. They did have the political will to unanimously do the resolution. But in Utah, we're able to get things done. And I think, looking at how we prepare a sound foundation, how do we prepare to make sure that our state going forward has the ability to meet the needs that we have here? And are there ways in looking at this that there are sound money alternatives that might help us go forward? And really grateful for the group that we have to look at these questions, put them on the table, see what legislative next steps might be, and do the things that we can do in Utah that we know Washington can't, because we are going to take care of our people. We are going to make sure that we have a sound, solid foundation going forward. And with that, I'm excited to have the input and expertise that we have, and very excited to hear from Brian that I was really astounded as we got into this to realize that our number one export in Utah is gold by more than 7 times number 2. Our number one import in Utah is also gold by more than double the number 2. We've got refineries and we've got Brinks vaulting systems and things in Utah that position us to take advantage of what the world is now doing and moving from dollars to precious metals. And there's something happening. Money is changing, and we certainly want to be on the forefront of that as it does. So, Treasurer Oaks, thank you for your foresight and your leadership and you being ahead of the curve on these things, and grateful that you're leading us through this study group.
Well, thank you. And Representative Ivory, we owe a great debt of gratitude to you. You are a miracle worker and bringing a bill back from the dead 6 times during the legislative session in HB 348. So I don't know how you did it, but that's why we're here. So thank you. Brian, we're going to turn the time over to you. You've got 15 minutes to use however you would like. You can do a Q&A in the middle or after, however you would like to do it. But we're going to turn the time over to Brian Summers, the president of Utah Mining Association, to talk about the gold industry in Utah.
Well, thank you very much. Thank you, Treasurer Oaks, Representative Ivory. I'm happy to be here. So again, my name is Brian Summers. I'm the president of the Utah Mining Association. So the Utah Mining Association was founded in 1915. We're one of the older industrial organizations in the state, and we represent most of the large mine operators in the state and a number of service companies that work in the mining industry. So, as would befit any good association executive, I'm going to brag on my industry a little bit, obviously, and also wanted to sort of to help you understand what an important industry mining has been for the state of Utah. This is actually a picture of, you can get a much better view of this if you go out into the rotunda here, just a few steps away. This is part of the cyclorama that depicts some of the pivotal events in Utah's history. This is General Patrick Connor inaugurating mining. General Connor was sent out to keep an eye on the Mormons and figured that, he didn't really need to worry that much. And so he decided to go get into other exploits, and one of which was mining, and actually inaugurated our first commercial mining district in 1863. It's actually still our largest and most productive commercial mining district, the Bingham District, where Rio Tinto Kennecott is. So a very important part of our history. This is actually one of two paintings in the governor's office that also depicts the Bingham Canyon mine. On the left, you'll see a picture of Daniel Jackling. This used to be in the courtyard and is now by the horseshoe here at the Capitol. Will be back in the courtyard when the construction's done. But he's the one that actually came up with the process that is still in use today in many porphyry mining operations where they've got a lot of different types of metals that are all mixed together in low grades. And he developed a process that, again, is still used all over the world today to actually be able to exploit those low grade porphyry deposits. Started the Utah Copper Company 121 years ago. And, the rest is history. Also, you'll see the governor's mansion, or as I like to refer to it, the Kern's mansion, was built with Kern silver money from the Park City Summit District. And now again is the governor's house. So I wanted to talk a little bit about the contribution of the mining economy, and really the best study we have on this actually lumps in mining, oil and gas and energy, but they're all very, closely related. Here we rely on fossil fuels for about 90% of our electricity production. But those industries together, it's about almost $23 billion in combined GDP contribution, about 10% of our state's GDP, and about 20% actually of our state's tax revenue. So you can see we actually punch far above our weight in terms of our contribution to the state's tax base. About 162,000 combined direct and indirect jobs. And also importantly, on average, our wages are almost 51% higher than the Utah average. And you can see here, and especially in some of the counties where they have, the rural counties where they have very large mining and extractive industries, you can see how much more you can make in a mining or extractive industry versus the county average. And that actually, interesting, holds true even in Salt Lake City. So actually, on average, the highest paying job you can get in Salt Lake City is in the mining industry. So we do I have to admit, sometimes we go back and forth between mining and the tech industry and the financial services industry, but this last round of data that we have from DWS, we're back on top, so I'm going to brag about it. Just for the mining sector, we had about $4.7 billion in mineral production in 2022. We were ranked 8th nationally for non-fuel mineral production and 12th nationally for coal production. And one thing I want to brag on, this is a study that just came out a couple of weeks ago. This is a study from the Fraser Institute, which is a Canadian think tank. And for many years, they've done a survey of executives in the mining industry and asked them, anywhere in the world that you want to go to mine, of all the global mining jurisdictions, where do you most want to mine? And in this last survey, Utah came out on top. So number one for mining. And actually, interestingly, there are two different indexes that make up this ranking: the investment attractiveness index. Again, what are the prospects? How are you going to be able to make money if you go into these jurisdictions? And then also the policy perception index. How friendly are the public policies, regulatory environment for mining? And Utah actually came out on top in both of those indexes, beating places like Nevada, Saskatchewan, Western Australia, other very prominent mining jurisdictions. So this is something we're very, very proud of. So what do we produce in Utah? We produce all kinds of stuff. This is a list, not actually a complete list even, of some of the major commodities that we produce here in Utah. And you can tell by the map that we produce them all over the state. So Utah is very fortunate in that we have a very diverse mineral estate. We produce a lot of different minerals, and we also produce them in many different parts of the state. So again, this is an industry that really has a statewide impact. What we want to talk about today, obviously, are precious metals. So these are the precious metals, and I'm telling you guys stuff you probably already know here, but that little center part of the periodic table, gold, silver, platinum, palladium, and then what we call the platinoids or the platinum group, which in addition to platinum and palladium, you also have the other 4 metals in the platinoid group there. And actually what we produce in Utah are those first 4. So we don't produce any of the platinoids aside from platinum and palladium. And I want to just go into a little bit about what we actually do produce here. So again, our first mining district, still our largest mining district, the most productive, and in terms of precious metals is by far our most productive. So in the Rio Tinto Kennecott and Canyon mine, we produce gold, silver, platinum, and palladium. And we'll talk about this a little bit later, but the gold and silver we actually refine, we process and refine here to where it's a saleable product. The platinum and palladium we actually send out of state and out of country as a concentrate, and it's refined further elsewhere. We also have a mine in the Tintic district in Eureka, about 2 hours south of here, where we are mining gold there as well. And then also the Desert Hot Kiewit mine out in the West Desert, where we're also producing gold. So those are our precious metal producing mines. I am gonna, yes, please.
I'm sorry.
Yeah.
The Tintic mine, has that been in and out and in?
Yeah, thank you. I appreciate that. Yeah, so that actually is a historic mine. The Trixie mine is a mine that came online first in the 1940s, although there's been production in that Tintic district for a very long time. It was in production, kind of went out of production. It actually came back into production about 4 years ago, and then was acquired by a mid-level Canadian mining company a couple of years ago for about $200 million. So that's a real success story for us. And also the Trixie mine is an interesting, it sort of shows you the vagaries of mining that, you know, when it closed down back in the early 2000s, it was mostly being mined for flux for the smelter at Bingham Canyon mine. They weren't finding high grades of ore there that made it that made it profitable. They closed the mine down when it reopened, and this was after a company came in and really put together a big land package and a bunch of different historic mines. When they reopened it, they went about 18 feet from where they had stopped mining before and ran into one of the highest grade veins of ore we've ever seen in the state of Utah. And they started producing a lot of gold, making a lot of money, and that's what ultimately led to their acquisition a couple of years ago. And the Desert Hawk mine is similar. This happens quite frequently in mining. I mean, we are constrained by global commodity prices and other economic issues. So the Desert Hawk mine, went in and out of production, but is in production now. So these are the three places where we're actually producing precious metals today.
Brian, I'm sorry,
Yeah,
I'm just where the Desert Hawk is, where's that?
So if you can see that little red dot way out in the West Desert there, in Tooele County, yeah,
okay.
the Kiewit mine. So it's really out in the middle of nowhere. So, yeah, and again, that can be a challenge sometimes that, in many cases, these deposits are in places that don't have a lot of infrastructure, and that's something that has to be taken into account as you're deciding to open up a mining operation or reopen one.
Brian, for those of us who are not initiated into this,
Yeah.
what's the difference between rare earth metals and what we produce? And does it overlap with what you were showing on the prior slide?
Thank you. That's a great question. So if I go back to the periodic table, so the rare earths are actually that bottom row down there. And we produce rare earths in Utah right now through secondary processing. So we're actually bringing in minerals from other states that are byproducts of titanium and zirconium mining in Georgia, Florida, places that have more of those coastal heavy sand deposits. And what we're doing actually is sending them down to our uranium mill in Blanding in southeastern Utah. This monazite, it's called the mineral, it actually has a number of rare earths in it, but it also has uranium and thorium, which are radioactive. And so the uranium mill pulls out that uranium and thorium and can use that for productive purposes. And then they isolate those rare earth elements. And so this is actually one of the most advanced rare earth supply chains that we have in the US right now. But the actual minerals don't come from Utah, but the processing happens here. But again, it's much more advanced than what they're doing in other parts of the country. And that's something where, we've really got to get our act together as a country because, China controls about 90% of that market. And it's been a huge problem for us. So that doesn't actually overlap with the current precious metal production we have. But, as we'll talk about here and as you're bringing up, a lot of these minerals tend to be co-located. So it's very rare that you just have one mineral in a deposit.
And would you say that if you develop a longer term plan on this issue, that needs to be a subcomponent of what?
Absolutely. All critical minerals need to be part of our plans as a state and as a country. And especially those ones where, again, we have real vulnerabilities in terms of having supply chains controlled by countries that are our geopolitical foes. The largest one, again, being China, but also, there are other supply chains that are controlled by Russia and Iran and other places that are not our friends. So, I don't worry about, aluminum that's coming down from Canada, for example, but rare earths coming from China or graphite that's coming from China, germanium, whatever the case is, that can be a huge problem for us. So, I did want to go through quickly, and again, I apologize if I'm telling you guys stuff that you already know. But again, most of our precious metals come out of the Rio Tinto Kennecott mine. And so I just wanted to briefly take you through the process of how this works. So again, this is a low-grade ore. It's called a porphyry deposit. You've got a lot of different minerals that are mixed in together. So they go into the mine. They're basically, going and targeting where they have the highest grade deposits of ore within this mountain, essentially. They loosen it up with explosives and big shovels, put the ore into the large haul trucks that I'm sure you've seen. That ore actually goes to a concentrator, which is outside of the mine. If you ever go along and can kind of see the west bench there, just to the north of the big pit is this concentrator. You can probably see the building and the big A-frame there. And what happens there is that ore gets through a series of mechanical processes, gets concentrated down till it's about 80% copper. So it goes from where it can be, really fractional amounts of copper in the ore body. It gets concentrated till it's about 80%. Then it actually gets sent up in a slurry line to the smelter, which is the Garfield smelter, which is right at the top. It's kind of close to Saltaire. If you've ever been out on I-80 there, you've seen the big smokestack. That's actually one of the largest freestanding structures west of the Mississippi, which is kind of fun. And there, through heat processes, essentially, I mean, the smelting that you've all probably been exposed to in some form or fashion, they get that copper to about a 90% concentration. And then the copper goes next door to the refinery, and there, through a series of electrolytic processes using chemicals and electricity, they actually pull the copper and concentrate it even further. They pull it onto cathodes, which are these big 300-pound cathodes that are ultimately sold into the market. And that becomes 99.99% pure copper, which then is acceptable for being sold into the manufacturing industry. As part of that process in the refinery, there's actually other elements then that fall out of that, out of the concentrate. And that's where you get what's called an electrolytic sludge, which contains gold, which contains silver, molybdenum, platinum, palladium, all the other things that are in that ore body in very small amounts. And again, the silver and the gold, they actually go a further refining step and do that on site at Rio Tinto to where they can have saleable gold that goes, and we'll talk about that a little bit later too, that goes into industry. And then again, the copper, or I'm sorry, the molybdenum, platinum, palladium, rhenium, tellurium, they all go to external facilities for further processing. So again, very rich ore body, very complicated processes, but ones that, again, give us a lot of the wealth we enjoy here in our state. The other way you get, so the Tintic mine, the Trixie mine, and the Desert Hawk mine, they actually use a slightly different process, a heap leaching process, where basically they take the ore and put it on a heap leach pad or into vats, and they use mostly chemical processes to basically leach the ore, the gold out of the host rock. And so that's a slightly different process. And then it will go to a refinery to get to final processing. So here in terms of the processing, we have two refineries here in the state, Rio Tinto Kennecott, which I just explained their process, and then Asahi Refining, which is also in Salt Lake City, and they're actually a contract refiner. And so when Treasurer Oaks was talking about the gold imports, that's mostly going into this refinery. So they're pulling in gold, from our producers. Also, they refine the gold from the Trixie mine and the Kiewit mine, but they also pull in a lot of gold from other countries and other states and refine that gold again to where it gets into a sellable state. Yes.
People sending their unrefined gold here because it's just a lot more economical for them. Is it a really expensive process?
Yeah.
Do that themselves?
So that's a great question. So a lot of why, and again, I have to put the disclaimer that these guys are actually not my members, and so I don't have as much insight into their processes and operations as I do into Rio Tinto Kennecott. But in most cases, the reason that it's sent here is, one, because of expertise. I mean, when you're refining something as valuable as gold or silver, you want people to know what they're doing, because you have to get to that purity that's going to be, in demand, and especially in an investment context. And then also, there's just not that many refineries. So, if you look at, if you're going through this from a polymetallic perspective, like they do at Rio Tinto Kennecott, and you're using a copper smelter to then get to some of these other ores, there's actually only 2 copper smelters left in the US. There's another one that may be coming online in Arizona. Again, it's been out of commission for a number of years, but there's just not a lot of refineries, and that's true on those that are just focusing on gold and silver as well. So some of it is just scarcity. It's, location basic. Where's the mining happening, and so where's the closest refinery to where where you're actually doing the mining and getting the ore. So,
Brian, following on that, what are the biggest constraints that they have? I mean, are we anywhere close to capacity? And if not, what are the constraints that we would have to kind of be number one from number one, right? How do we even, do better than we're doing now?
Yeah. And again, I couldn't speak for the contract refining side, but in terms of Rio Tinto, they actually do have capacity at their smelter. But again, it takes us, you would have to have an ore that's similar to what they already smelt and refine in their processes, but they actually do take concentrate from other operators. And so there is room for expansion with, at least the Rio Tinto operations. Part of the problem, frankly, though, is economical. In some cases, it is actually cheaper, shockingly, to send your concentrate to China and have it refined there than it is to, I'll use again, Rio Tinto as an example. They've got a mine in Arizona that they've been trying to open up for a number of years. They're having federal permitting problems. That's a whole other story we should talk about at some point. But the Resolution mine down there would be one of the largest copper mines in the world if they can ever get it open. They've actually done the analysis, and it would actually be cheaper for them to take that copper and send it to China to be refined than it would be to put it on a train and get it up to Utah to be refined in their own smelter.
Is that's just federal regs?
And yeah, safety regulations, environmental regulations, cost of labor, et cetera. But if you're sending your copper to China to be smelted, it's not going to be done in an environmentally or labor friendly way, obviously, not to mention all the impacts of shipping that overseas, et cetera. So, I mean, this is a challenge for us because, in most cases, if you go to a country that doesn't have any of the kind of labor and environmental protections that we have, it's going to be cheaper for you to process, especially on these large scales.
And the mining that's happening, is that all just on private land?
It depends. So it's all over the place, to be honest. So
is there, and I guess the real question is how much of that is allowed, are we able to do on federal controlled land?
So Rio Tinto Kennecott is all private land, which is quite unique. Most of the land for the Trixie mine is private, which is also fairly unique. And part of that is because these are historic mining districts. So Desert Hawk actually they have basically all the landlords. So they have some private land, they have some Sitla land, and they have some BLM land. So they've got a little bit of everything. And federal permitting can be a real problem. Some of it honestly depends on the commodity. I mean, the federal government tends to be more responsive to permitting commodities that are, in demand or that are less controversial. If you try and get something permitted that has any kind of controversy associated with it, especially with this administration, that can be very, very difficult. So the Biden administration has permitted 2 mines in 3.5 years in office, which is crazy. Not in Utah, like nationwide. So, I mean, we're never going to be able to keep up with the demand and reshore all of the mineral production we need to if we're permitting 2 mines a year. And I mean, they've taken more large mines offline through various federal actions than they've permitted. So this administration is not mining friendly, despite all of their rhetoric about wanting to increase critical mineral supply and other mineral supply. So
just in the interest of time, if I can, we're running out of time.
Yeah.
If we can,
I'll
let Brian kind of get through his, and then we're gonna have time after, if that's okay. Okay.
I won't get into this, but we do have a lot of exploration going on right now. So you can see again all over the state different commodities, and again a lot of these are co-located, and some of them are co-located with critical minerals, which again have a lot of there's federal grants and other possibilities for even quicker permitting if you've got a critical mineral associated with your non-critical minerals. Although, I would argue that any mineral that you need is critical. So, and I won't get into this either, but again, like the critical mineral discussion is really, it's great in that it's brought a lot of attention to our supply chain issues and the need to produce more of our minerals here, but also these arbitrary lists that we have that the federal government is putting together can sometimes not be very helpful. So I mean, things get put onto the list and kicked off of the list, and it's quite arbitrary in many cases. So I'll just get in. I've just got a couple more slides here. So this is actually from a report from the Ken Gardner Institute, which was actually just released last week at a trade conference that they had here in Salt Lake City. So in terms of our largest export, $7.2 billion in value, and this is for primary metals. And that's 41.2% of all of Utah's exports. Of that 41.2%, 39.9% is unwrought gold. And unwrought gold just means the gold that you see here in the picture. So it's gold that's in a, in bar form and bullion form that can go into a manufacturing type of situation. That's just the meaning of unwrought there. And 6.8 billion of that has gone to the UK. Now, to be honest with you, this is something that's a little bit of a mystery to me. Most of the gold, again, I can only speak for Rio Tinto, but most of the gold that Rio Tinto sells is actually sold domestically. So I don't know. I actually don't think there's a lot of physical gold going to the UK. So I feel like this might be, where is the gold being sold? Is it being sold through the London, an exchange in London? I really don't know, to be honest with you. So it's a little bit of a mystery to me because I really don't believe that we're sending millions and millions of ounces of gold overseas to the UK. It's not particularly easy to transport gold. And so that's a little bit of a mystery to me, and something that in preparing for this, I actually need to realize that I need to dig into this further. So the UK thing is a little bit of a mystery. Yeah, this is right from the Kim Gardner report. And also from that report, the economic impact. And so I've broken this out into sort of, purely domestic production versus the imports, which is that, contract refining. So on the left there, this is our domestic production that we've, from Utah, 144, almost 45,000 troy ounces in 2022, $261 million in value. So, and then under the line here, these are Kim Gardner's models. And so they actually decided that was worth about $281 million in sales value. I'm not sure I agree with that. 109 million in earnings, 1,800 jobs, and $202 million in state GDP impact. And then you can see this again as the gold that we're importing to be refined here, almost 2.2 million pounds, or 2.2 million troy ounces, with almost $3 billion value. And then again, I'm not quite sure the model. They basically, Kim, and I have to be careful so Sophia doesn't beat me up, she's on the board, but they basically had a model that they used for all of their other exports and decided that they didn't like that for gold. And so they created a new model. And that's something that I guess economists get to do. But anyway, these are their jobs for the contract, refining. Again, I'm a little skeptical of those numbers, but the top numbers are from, reports that are pretty widely used. So I think we can be pretty confident about that. And then you always get to argue with economists. So that's all I've got. Just remember this: Utah, the best jurisdiction in the world for mining. So,
there you go.
Yeah.
Excellent. Well, thank you, Brian. And after when we're done, feel free to speak with Brian, ask additional questions. That's one reason why we're having time after the meeting, just for other questions. So
I have a question.
Yes.
We can maybe bring that up during the larger Q&A.
Okay, that would be great. Luke, do we still have you?
Here I am. Yes, sir. I'll
Okay.
share my screen here.
Utah report first, or then?
Yeah, we definitely could. Yeah, maybe what let's do is, Kevin, do you want to just briefly touch on the Utah report that was done back in 2016?
If you want, I can kind of do a lead in on
Yeah,
that. So we established a federal funds commission in the state that's now been incorporated into the Federalism Commission to kind of look at the dependence, what could we do about it, and how at risk are we? And we put out an RFP to do a risk analysis of, what is the danger to Utah when we've got the sources of funds that we do. And Kevin Freeman, who has a economic outlook work that he's done, and a number of different books that I can't even remember the titles of them, you'll tell us, but they were all dealing with the kind of economic risk. And he responded to the RFP and did a risk analysis for the state of Utah in 2016, looking forward, trying to give us the worst case scenario, looking forward to what we might be facing. And Kevin, maybe you can summarize where we are now based on what you found in 2016 and what we're seeing now, only 8 years on.
Well, thank you, Ken, and thank you, Marlo. Appreciate you all. I'm sorry I walked in so late. I did not have a chance to change. I was 6 hours at the Dallas-Fort Worth Airport, and every flight was sold out because of the weather yesterday. But this is the report I published in January 2016, and it covered fiscal risk, currency risk, cyber risk, capital markets risk, global markets risks. Probably be helpful for me to share a little of my background I'm an investment manager by training, hold the Chartered Financial Analyst designation. I built the John Templeton's private client group from 1992 to the year 2000, where I retired. We managed in the private client group about $2.5 billion. I did research trips with the great ones at Templeton, including Mark Mobius, to Russia, to China, and around the world. I have 4 decades in the investment industry, but in the year 2008, I saw things happening unusually in the financial markets, particularly with credit default swaps and naked short selling. I brought it to the attention of some friends in the Pentagon. My former colleague at Templeton was Eric Davidson. He's a finance professor at Baylor University, but he was also the chief investment officer of Wells Fargo after he departed, and he and I were talking. It looks like potential financial terrorism. And so the Pentagon hired me as an economic warfare expert, and I began analysis on the vulnerability, because America's uniqueness in large part flows from its economic prowess, and our financial capabilities. And if you were to take down the dollar, if you were to crash our stock market, any number of things that would be non-kinetic methods of destroying the United States. And in fact, that is in the Chinese warfare doctrine. It's in the old Soviet doctrine. It's in the Russian doctrine. It's in the North Korean doctrine, even to the extent that they're counterfeiting bills on a regular basis. So I became the economic warfare expert for the Pentagon. I briefed the Defense Intelligence Agency, the SEC, the Office of Net Assessment in the Pentagon, the CIA, DARPA, war colleges, admirals, and generals, and there was a general ignorance of economic warfare. One of my conclusions in my research, originally 2009, 2010, was that the phase 3 attack would happen to go against the United States dollar. And I don't know that it could succeed, but I know that's the target. At the time, it was seen as ridiculous and unlikely, because everybody depends on the dollar, and China is our friend, and China loans us all kinds of money and so forth. Well, the conclusion of this report in 2016 was that our debt path is unsustainable and is probably our greatest vulnerability. I looked into things like solar storms, I looked into cyber attacks, I looked into everything else, and I said, in the warfare doctrines of our enemies, attacking our currency is perhaps their largest target. Well, whether they'll succeed or not, I can't tell you. I've updated this work recently with what I call 5 undeniable truths. And these are economic truths, and I'll share them with you quickly. Number 1, our debt path is unsustainable. And that should be undeniable. After all, Jerome Powell has said it. After all, the Office of Management and Budget has said it. The Congressional Budget Office, it's bipartisan in the conclusion, it is unsustainable. When I wrote the book Pirate Money, I see a few of you have that in June of last year, June 24th of last year. So about 11 months ago, our U.S. national debt was $32.1 trillion. When I looked at it on May 20th, it was $34.7 trillion. We've increased our debt $2.64 trillion in 11 months. That is not sustainable. Elon Musk recently said, we better do something about our national debt or the dollar will be worth nothing. Why is that? Because it's unsustainable. And it's unsustainable for one reason, is the current spread on Treasury is 4 to 5%. If you want to borrow at any point along the Treasury curve, 3 months to 30 years, you're going to be paying somewhere in the 4 to 5% range. If you just apply simple math to a almost $35 trillion debt, you're going to have eventually the largest budget item just for interest only. That'll consume half of all of the federal tax revenues. So The Economist magazine last month, May 2nd, or a few weeks ago, America's fiscal outlook is disastrous but forgotten, comes to this conclusion. If the Federal Reserve holds rates at their current level, the next 12 months interest, annual interest rate payments will reach $1.6 trillion. Think about that. That is unsustainable. The Office of Management and Budget says that we will have a $54 trillion debt over the next 10 years, and the Congressional Budget Office outlook is $100 trillion in projected deficits over the next 30 years. This is unsustainable. It is without argument. If you think about that, and in the terms of what we're facing, then the second undeniable truth is other nations are targeting our currency. Whether they can succeed or not, I know the argument is the cleanest dirty shirt in the laundry is the US dollar, and therefore we'll continue to wear it and the world will continue to wear it. That's becoming a less appealing argument over time as our shirt is getting dirtier and dirtier. But the fact is, other nations are targeting our currency. I did the work. Vladimir Putin in 2006 decided he wanted to remove the dollar's reserve currency. In 2008, Igor Panarin, one of Putin's closest advisors, comes out in the Wall Street Journal and he says mass immigration, economic decline, moral degradation will trigger a civil war in America and the collapse of the dollar. He called the US foreign debt a pyramid scheme and said China and Russia would usurp Washington's role as global financial regulator. I point that out not to say that they can succeed, but that they are certainly trying. In 2008, during the Summer Olympics, according to Hank Paulson, the Secretary of the Treasury, Russia, the Chinese told him that Russia had approached them and said, let's dump all of our federal agency debt. We will dump all our Fannie, all our Freddie holdings, and we will crash the dollar. The Chinese at the time said, no, we don't want to participate in that. But in 2013, Xi Jinping came to power and he said one of our top objectives as China is to de-Americanize the world and to de-dollarize the world. When I reported that in Washington, I did a big event at the Heritage Foundation. Washington Post came out and wrote an article about it, and they said, oh, that's nonsense. They're just talking, it's bluster. Well, it's no longer considered bluster when you have Foreign Affairs, CNN, and all of these publications acknowledging, yes, the foreign stated goal is to displace the dollar. Foreign Affairs, China is quietly trying to dethrone the dollar. CNN, China continues to de-dollarize reserves as gold stockpile climbs. And of course, you have, again, Elon Musk with his impeccable logic. We have used our dollar multiple times as a currency weapon to attack or control other nations. It's an economic weapon that we've unleashed. Elon Musk says if you weaponize your currency enough times, other countries will stop using it. Putin has gone to India. Putin has said directly to the nation of India, look, you're America's ally now, but who was America's ally during World War II? China and the Soviet Union. Now, who is America's enemy or adversary? China and the Soviet Union. Who is America's enemy in World War II? Germany and Japan. Who's America's ally today? Germany and Japan. You can't let Washington dictate foreign policy, and you certainly can't let them do it via the dollar. And by the way, we can disintermediate the dollar. You no longer have to translate your currency into US dollars to do business between Brazil and China. You can do business directly with the Chinese yuan or any other currency. So Elon Musk warns that other nations will stop using it. This, I think, is an undeniable truth that they're going to attack our dollar. I'm not going to claim that they can succeed, but that's the second undeniable truth. Third undeniable truth is when we financialized our economy, starting in 1971, we created an increasing wealth gap. The wealth gap is built in large part because those from the Cantillon effect, those closest to the creation of money, can profit and benefit from it. I learned how to hedge against inflation. The average American does not have that opportunity to hedge against inflation. They don't know how to do it. In fact, if you're living paycheck to paycheck, as most Americans are today, you get an extra $1,000 or $2,000. You can't put it in the futures market or derivatives or even in physical gold, because how would you get out of the physical gold if you had an immediate financial need? That was part of the conclusion of the fiscal risk analysis report, is we've increased this wealth gap. And when you do that, Cantillon wrote in 1755 in France, and what was it, 3 decades later, and there was a French Revolution because the wealth gap had increased so much. So that's the third undeniable truth. Inflation has created a wealth gap. Since 1971 to the present, the dollar's lost 90% of its purchasing power according to the Consumer Price Index. The fourth undeniable truth, which I'll share with you, is governments around the world are planning to weaponize their currency. Now, to them, they don't call it weaponization. They're just getting greater control. But central bank digital currencies, and I can show you the videos from the IMF, from the Bank of International Settlements, from the World Economic Forum, where they are all saying, oh, won't this be wonderful? We'll be able to create a new all-electronic currency, and we'll be able to, for example, dictate what people are allowed to buy and not allowed to buy. We'll be able to advance monetary policy by we can turn money off after a certain date so it has an expiration date, or maybe we can turn it off for now and later to use this as a form of monetary policy. We can control people, so how much soda they can drink, whether they do things that are bad for them or whatever. And President Biden's executive order 14067 made it clear that his intention and purpose for money is to advance DEI, diversity, equity, and inclusion, and to solve ESG, environment, social, governance problems. It's straight there in the executive order. That's even more true in China, where they're attaching social credit scores to the digital yuan. Now, is this going to happen? I don't know. There's a House just passed in Congress that they're going to prevent the advance of the central bank digital currency. The Republicans did it on party lines. The Democrats said, why should you stop the advance of technology? And so there's a battle that will take place in Congress. But I can tell you the fourth undeniable truth is governments intend to weaponize currency in one form or fashion. And the fifth undeniable truth is money is changing in major ways. A friend of mine was the lawyer for Peter Thiel when PayPal was created. Over the past 25 years, we've seen massive changes in the presentation of money, whether it is tap to pay with your phone or your watch, or whether it is Venmo or Zelle or PayPal, or whether it is central bank digital currencies. Money is changing around the world in major ways. And these five undeniable truths led me to begin a project that I call Pirate Money, which is what the book is about, where we take advantage at the state level in the Constitution of making gold and silver transactional money that can be used not to replace the Federal Reserve, but as an optional monetary system that people could use. 25 states are looking at it. Utah, that was in your original bill, Ken, I know. It is a part of the history of Utah to embrace gold and silver. You did the Legal Tender Act. The problem with the Legal Tender Act, however, is when you produce these silver coins, the silver rounds that are 1 ounce, they're not transactional under the IRS code definition. You can't walk into your coffee shop and buy a cup of coffee and get like change back. You can't pay your mortgage with it. You can't pay all your employees with it. And therefore, they're treated as collectibles. What I proposed in the book Pirate Money, and I don't know if you want me to get into this, but it's my passion. I flew here all day to get here, so I'm going to tell you. My passion is to put gold and silver in a vaulted system, a government-based or sponsored vault, and then put electronic transfer capabilities attached to it. So you could use a debit card. I see Jason Cousins is the founder of Glentz. He's on the screen. He invented such a system. It operates out of London. I use it quite effectively and enjoy it. My gold is held in Switzerland, and I'm able to transact business with a MasterCard. It's a beautiful system. I don't want my gold in Switzerland. I don't want the company operating it in the United Kingdom. I want it here in the United States. It could be in Utah, it could be in Kansas, it could be in Texas, it could be in Florida. In fact, 25 states are aggressively moving forward, looking at this. I just came from the Texas GOP convention. Texas is similarly a Republican-controlled state, and we got it put into the platform that they will do this next year. And in fact, it made the top 10 priorities, which indicates to the governor, to the lieutenant governor, and to the leadership, this is what we want you to do as a party. I spent the last week at the GOP convention mentioning that, covering it, and explaining it. So that is what I recommend to the state of Utah and to this august group of the Precious Metals Work Group, that you make it transactional electronic transfer capabilities where you can keep track of it, because most of our money, I've got some money in my wallet. I have much more in a bank. There's a $100 bill. I have many more of these in digital form held in a bank, and I'm able to do business with them. I think gold could operate the exact same way.
Thank you. Thank you, Kevin. Luke, bring us home.
Yeah, I think for Luke to tell us why this all matters and why we're even exploring this, right?
Absolutely. So I'm going to run through a presentation, why gold? And I think it'll be pretty self-evident here in a moment. We're in the first global sovereign debt bubble in 80 to 100 years, except this time it's centered in the West. So these two lines, the orange line are developed markets, the green line are emerging markets. These are federal government, central government debt to GDP ratios. These aren't fully up. Yes, sir.
Luke, can you put the what is it, the slideshow
The presentation mode.
Presentation mode there.
Oh, yeah, bear with me here. Hold on. There we go. How's that? Better?
There we
Yep,
go.
yes, that's it.
All right, perfect.
Thank you.
So the orange line's developed economy, green line are emerging markets. You can see we all remember the emerging market debt crises in the 80s, 90s, early 2000s, when the green line hit where the orange line has now surpassed. We have not seen the orange line at these levels since the immediate aftermath of World War II and really the immediate aftermath of World War I. The thing they have in common is once you get to where we are now in the developed economies and in the US in particular, is that they're resolved really only two ways over the past 120 to 140 years. You either default or restructure the debt, or you inflate the debt away. And there have been a few hyperinflations. And I think it's important as we have this discussion around inflation, deflation, it's centered around this concept that we've been able to have in the US over the last 40, 50 years of demand, supply chain interruptions, etc. What has been lost in America, but I think we're probably a few years away from being reminded, is that the great inflations in history have not come from interruptions in supply, demand, etc. They have come when an over-indebted government starts losing its foreign financing in sufficient amounts and its central bank begins printing money to sustain the nominal value of the debt, the nominal solvency of the debt. And we are about several years into that in the case of the US. This is a really interesting study done by Hirschman Capital using data from Reinhardt and Rogoff. He said since 1800, 51 out of 52 countries with the gross government debt to GDP of over 130% have defaulted, either through restructuring, devaluation, high inflation, or outright default. 51 out of 52. I've been in the investments and finance business for 30 years. That's a 98% ratio. 98% ratios do not come around in finance. The one country that did not, that most people have pointed to and said, see, it doesn't have to end badly, is Japan. And those people that used to say, see, it doesn't have to end badly, Japan's fine, have gotten very quiet over the last several months. This is examples of where it happens. And critically, most of these countries don't outright default on a nominal basis. They default via a decline in the real value of the currency in which the bond's interest and principal is repaid. So let's talk through what's going on very quickly here. Back in November 2013, as was just referenced, China made one of the biggest macro announcements in 50 years. The People's Bank of China came out and said it is no longer in China's interest to increase reserves, which in plain English means we're done growing our holdings of treasuries. Thank you very much. What followed was, as you can see in this chart, the blue line is central bank FX reserves. About 2/3 of that is held in US treasuries. About a little less than 1/3 is in euro-denominated debt, and then there's sort of an assortment of other things, but it's mostly treasury bonds. You can see global central banks stopped buying holdings of treasuries a full decade ago. What did not stop growing, as you can see, is the US federal debt in red. When central banks stopped buying federal debt stopped buying growing FX reserves, mostly comprised of US federal debt, back in 2014, central banks had about $12 trillion of FX reserves, and the US had about 17 and change trillion in foreign debt. In that time, our debt has basically doubled, and the FX reserves haven't moved at all. This lack of sufficient buying of treasuries while the US federal debt rises exponentially kicks off what we have repeatedly shown for our clients, which is a US balance of payments vicious cycle. You start at the 12 o'clock position on a clock face here. US deficits go up. That drives an increase in US federal borrowing due to either a fall in tax receipts or a rise in spending. You go over to the 3 o'clock position. Since foreign central banks aren't lending enough money to the US government anymore, per the prior chart, and since the Fed is no longer doing QE, the US begins to borrow more from the global private sector. We go down to the 6 o'clock position since US federal borrowing demand is secularly rising by a significant percent of private sector income growth. And let me translate that for a moment. The United States is running a 2%, or excuse me, $2 trillion deficit with full employment. Global GDP is about $100 trillion, growing nominally about 6% per year. So every year, there is about $6 trillion in GDP, new GDP growth. The United States needs to consume $2 trillion of that just to finance deficits at full employment. If the US has a recession, that number goes to 3 trillion or more, while the 6 trillion comes down. This is why you start to see the federal government borrowing, crowding out global dollar markets and global rates markets. What do you see? You see the dollar go up, paradoxically, and you see rates go up. Then you go to the 9 o'clock position. As the US federal government borrowing crowds out the global private sector, the dollar rises, rates rise, the global economy slows, US tax receipts fall, we go back to 1. As tax receipts fall, deficits rise, wash, rinse, repeat, until either basically the global debt market goes into a debt spiral, which we started to go into in third quarter of last year when the Treasury market, the long end treasuries fell 20% in under 3 months, or until we see what we've been getting at increasingly rapid or short cycle functions. We get the Fed and or Treasury to inject more dollar liquidity to support the Treasury market. This was alluded to before. This is, I think, is an enormously important chart. This is from the U.S. Treasury Borrowing Advisory Committee. It shows the largest outlays of the United States as of the end of fiscal 4Q23, which is end of September 2023. U.S. entitlements, which are health and human services and Social Security, represent around 70% of U.S. tax receipts. U.S. Treasury, which is interest expense on a gross basis, is about another 20 to 25%. So the United States government is spending nearly 100% of receipts just on entitlements and Treasury. You can see defense is about a third less than Treasury on a gross basis. And most importantly, this chart tells you there is nothing the federal government can cut to stop the deficits from growing. They can't cut entitlements anytime soon in sufficient amounts. They can cut interest expense, but they would have to cut rates dramatically, which is highly inflationary. Or they could slash defense. And if they slash defense, we basically pack up, we come home from Eurasia, we give Chinese and the Russians what they want, and we move on. That ain't happening either. So the result is going to be inflation. It's a virtual certainty, barring a productivity miracle. People say, well, this kind of thing has happened before. No, it hasn't. Nobody alive in this room has ever seen anything like what we're seeing. The red circle on the left shows the net debt service relative to U.S. defense outlays going back to 1960. In Cold War 1.0, net interest outlays were never anywhere near defense spending. In contrast, the red arrow shows that we are starting Cold War 2.0, as some are calling it, in the position that the USSR finished Cold War 1.0 in circa 1987 or 88, where their interest debt service is above their defense budget. And as I ask at the top, does anybody here think the US will lose Cold War 2.0 for lack of printing money to pin interest rates down so that we can invest what we need to invest in defense? I don't think that. I think there's zero chance of that happening. The release valve will have to be the currency and inflation. So when I showed you that vortex before, it becomes much more acute anytime the strong dollar and rising interest rates sends what we call true interest expense above US federal receipts. So true interest expense is simply that Treasury spending line plus the pay-go portion of entitlements, just the current outlays on a gross basis for Social Security and health and human services. We can see every time that number has gotten to nearly 100%, the Fed and or Treasury weaken the dollar, resume QE, or do something like that. And we are very close to that number here in 2024. This is another way of looking at the same problem. It's called the federal insolvency ratio. It is simply gross interest expense divided by federal receipts. Here's where we were in October 2023. Those are projected numbers that I composed at the time based on the assumptions in the chart. The last time it was this high was in early 1985, which is very important because this is a chart of the US dollar index, the DXY index, with the red circle. The last time the federal insolvency ratio was this high. The US 6 months later rolled out the Plaza Accord where the dollar was significantly devalued. And I think something said, while it was from a spike at that point in time, the punchline is that the dollar was made much weaker. Again, they weaken the dollar, they don't default on the debt. And I think something similar is going to happen. Now, this chart is busy and a bit wonkish, but what this shows us, the orange line is the US dollar and the red and green fluctuating line is something called US Treasury volatility. This is basically a function of how a graph of whether the US Treasury market is functioning well or not. And when that number goes up, the US Treasury market is breaking. You can see the first arrow at the left, it broke in the COVID crisis. And that's when the Fed came out and started doing $600 billion a week in QE for a bit. It broke again in the second arrow, 3Q23. Or excuse me, 3Q22. Again, the Fed weakened the dollar, Treasury weakened the dollar really in that case. Fed continued with QT, but Treasury offset it, more than offset it, by injecting dollar liquidity. Third arrow, it broke again with it was called a banking crisis. It wasn't. It was a Treasury market problem in 1Q23. Again, this time the Fed injected the liquidity. We saw it again, once again, hit up near that 140 level, Treasury volatility. And again, the Fed and Treasury this time weakened the dollar. We're near that again. This is a chart that is a simple ratio. It is the price of gold over the price of long-term US Treasury bond futures. The red arrow is when the global central banks stopped growing holdings of treasuries. Since that time, the price of gold has outperformed long-term US Treasuries by over 3x. These are two assets that should ultimately, treasuries should outperform. They pay an interest rate, gold does not. Why has gold outperformed US Treasuries by so much since 2014? Go back to that spot, that first point I made about the PBOC saying we're done buying treasuries. Since the PBOC said we're done buying treasuries, global central banks have on net sold treasuries, the red line, while buying gold, the blue line. It makes perfect sense that gold has outperformed treasuries massively since 2014. This here is another sort of wonkish chart, but I think very, very important message contained herein. This is US real interest rates. A real interest rate is simply the interest rate on 10-year US Treasuries minus the rate of inflation. In this chart, it is inverted. So the lower the blue line goes, the higher US real rates go. Gold over my entire career has traded, as you can see, very well correlated with inverted US real rates until 2022. All of a sudden, real rates went up and gold went up. The message here is that the United States fiscal situation, which many think is a crisis yet on the come, it began 2 years ago. Gold is telling us the United States has a fiscal crisis, not tomorrow, not in 5 years. It started in 2022. It's getting worse. It's going to continue to get worse. This is a great chart showing something that is forgotten among many US investors. It shows the annualized real returns for bonds was negative from 1900 to 1981. Most US investors remember 82 to 21 and say, wow, real returns for bonds were great. 22 was a disaster, as you can see. But in fourth turnings, when you have high debt ratios, when you have geopolitical tensions, when you have wars, when you have Cold Wars, you don't want to own long-term bonds. They lose money on a real basis for long periods of time. One last key point here is that, as was touched on earlier, the dollar is losing its market share in global oil markets. This was an article at the end of last year in the Wall Street Journal. The head of JP Morgan's commodities desk said an estimated 20% of global oil this year was bought and sold in non-dollars, led by China, Russia, Iran, and others. Furthermore, with the BRICS expanding, not a lot of people paid attention to the key thread tying in the nations that were invited and joined: Saudi Arabia, UAE, etc. Over 50% of global oil exports are now in or likely to soon be in the BRICS, suggesting that 20% non-oil volumes are likely to rise going forward. Why does that matter? This is a chart of China's FX reserves as a percent of China's GDP. Basically, as China can buy more and more of its oil and other commodities in its own currency, it does not need dollars, which means it does not need to buy treasury bonds, which is why their holdings of treasury bonds or their reserves as a percent of GDP has gone from 47% to 17% in 10 years. I'm frequently asked, what will oil exporters buy with their yuan? Here's your answer. It's China and Russian gold reserves. And nations that end up with Chinese yuan will buy Chinese goods with yuan and recycle the rest into gold. Why would they do that? Well, because it's a really good money-making idea. The price of gold and yuan has tripled in the last 4 or 5 years. It's a virtuous cycle. People end up with yuan, they buy gold, the price of gold goes up in yuan, they sell the gold for yuan, they can then buy more stuff from China, China can then buy more oil from them in yuan, they get more yuan, they buy more gold, wash, rinse, repeat. As they said in Jaws, the implications as for US policymakers is you're going to need a bigger boat, or in this case, a bigger Fed balance sheet. I hear all the time, the US is just going to be Japan. Japan has a bigger debt problem than we do, and they haven't had a problem. And there's some technicalities for why actually Japan's structure in 3 key ways is 180 degrees different from the US. But the key takeaway is this. If the US is Japan, which I agree, it's going to feel financially like Argentina in terms of the inflation rate. And what you can see in this chart is the US Fed balance sheet as a percent of GDP in red against the Bank of Japan balance sheet as a percent of GDP in blue. Now, we know when the Fed's balance sheet has gone up over the last 10, 15 years, anytime it goes up on a lag, we see asset price inflation and in some cases, significant consumer inflation. What this chart tells you, if the US is just going to be Japan, imagine if the Fed's balance sheet is 60% of US GDP, or roughly 15 or $17 trillion. Or if it's 100% of GDP, if the Fed's balance sheet goes to $25 trillion, it's going to be very inflationary. And ultimately, that's why gold. It's not the end of the world. It's just the end of a financialized era in the United States. And I would expect gold to continue outperforming long-dated US Treasury bonds, long-dated bonds, and long-dated Western sovereign bonds in total. So that's the end of the presentation. I thank you all for the time, and I'll cede any time I have left to the floor.
Any questions for Luke?
Yeah, I'll start off, Luke. Thank you very much. I guess that's kind of disturbing in terms of what's likely ahead. As I mentioned at the outset, starting off, introducing Kevin's study, right now about 30% of state receipts are federally sourced funds. That doesn't count what goes directly to counties, obviously direct payments to individuals, Social Security, the rest there, but just direct to state receipts. That's the #1 source of revenue. What you're describing, what does that import or portend for the state? How do we deal with that being our #1 source of revenue with what you see happening in treasuries and rates and that sort of thing? How do we weather the storms going forward, I guess, in the best way possible? What's that risk, and then how do we weather the storm?
I think for the payments of dollar cash, I think that you have to break the obligations down from the federal level into 2 pools. The Social Security side, and then the Medicare, Medicaid side, if you will. And that's I'm sure a vast oversimplification, but the point will be clear here in a second. Social Security is a cash payment with a COLA rider, cost of living adjustment rider. So basically, they're going to try to, they'll tell Utah citizens, inflation's 3 this year, you're going to get a COLA 3% on your Social Security, and away you go. That's fine. The real inflation will probably be 5 or 6, and they'll get 3, so they'll fall a little behind every year. But it's not a huge issue immediately. Over time it can be, but I think the Utah citizens will get paid everything they are owed in dollar terms. The trickier part is Medicare, Medicaid. It is frequently said that America can never have a huge debt crisis because we owe all our debt in a currency we can print. And for the Social Security side, for the federal debt, that is 100% true. For Medicare, Medicaid, we don't owe baby boomers, silent generation, and so forth. I think the number is anywhere from 30 to 50 trillion dollars in Medicare, Medicaid. We don't owe them dollars. We owe them hips. The federal government owes them knees. They owe them drugs. They owe them doctors' time, hospital bed. These things are finite, hard goods. They might as well be a foreign currency. The more money the government prints, the more the price of these goods are going to go up. The Medicare, Medicaid side of US federal obligations is very much like the gold obligations of Weimar German government in the 1920s, where the more they printed Reichsmarks to pay the debt, the higher gold went in Reichsmarks and the more they fell behind. And that, I think, is the really tricky side of federal obligations, which is to say, they can print the dollars to keep everything else whole, but the more they print dollars, the bigger the Medicare, Medicaid obligation is going to get. And how will they deal with that? And my guess is they will deal with that ultimately if this goes the way it could, and I think possibly or likely will ultimately go, by doing things like delaying services or extending them or whatever. Basically, hey, we'll get to you in 6 months. And so it becomes a political problem. Are there stopgap solutions the state can take in terms of setting aside funds ahead of time to try to make the quality of life in Utah better than it might be in other states as those delays happen? Do you attract more doctors into Utah by attractive tax treatments, things like that, so that there's a better services supply-demand ratio in Utah than elsewhere? Those are the types of things I would think about as a legislator in terms of the context of what I just described.
Other questions?
Just a quick question. Many of the charts that you showed indexed, the performance of the dollar against bond prices, that sort of thing. Does it change when you think in terms of equities and investment in equities? And how would equity performance stack up on the same charts relative to gold and silver?
It's a great question, and it's something I pulled out for the interest of brevity. But essentially, to me, I think for managing funds, what we are witnessing the early days of is, so the global bond market is roughly $130 trillion. The treasury market's about 25 trillion of that. By way of comparison, the US stock market, which I want to say is about 70% of global equity market cap, is about $65 trillion. Okay, so $130 trillion bond market, $65 trillion equity market in the US, $14 trillion gold market, $1.4 trillion Bitcoin market. What I think we are in the early days of watching in terms of that chart of gold over long bond, if I showed you a chart of S&P 500 over long bond, it would look like the same hockey stick. If I showed you a chart over the NASDAQ over the long bond, hockey stick. Bitcoin over the long bond, hockey stick. I think we are in early days of Mr. Market saying the long bond, the bubble, this time around, we're in the first global sovereign debt bubble in 100 years, centered in developing markets, or developed markets, excuse me. The bubble is the long-term US Treasury bond. Now, they will pay you every dollar you're owed. The dollar value is simply going to erode. And so you're seeing a very rational response from markets, which is the $130 trillion bond market starting to squeeze itself into the $65 trillion equity market, the $14 trillion gold market, and the $1.4 trillion Bitcoin market. And that's why those charts are hockey sticking that way. So ultimately, it's not all about gold, in my opinion. It is about preserving the purchasing power of your funds relative to needed goods and services. And equities do that better than long bonds. Gold does that better than long bonds. Bitcoin's going to do it, I think, better than most everything, but I think the volatility is going to be face peeling at times. And that's ultimately, I think, a key theme over the next really 2 to 4 years, because again, the interest expense getting to where it is very alarming. There was Neil Ferguson highlighted this in Bloomberg about a month ago. He said there's something called Ferguson's Law, which is that any great hegemonic power, once its debt service goes above its military spending, doesn't stay a hegemonic power for very long. He said it was true of Habsburg Spain, true of ancient regime France, true of the British Empire. Here we are as America. So these things are accelerating rapidly, in part because of the Fed's aggressive rate hikes.
So Luke, following up on that question then, if they're all hockey sticking, how do you rate the risk? So they're all accelerating because of the outward pressure on the bonds, but you've got a different risk profile to equities versus gold versus the others. How do you allocate that risk in terms of a state investor?
If I was a state investor, everyone's probably saying you want to own a 60-40 portfolio that has worked for the past 40 years like a charm, right? 60% equities, 40% bonds. I would take the 40% that's in bonds. I think short-term T-bills, I think they're fine. I own them, plenty of them myself. I'm happy to clip a 5.25% coupon, 3-month paper, not a lot of long-term duration risk. For the portion of my 40% that's in bonds that is in middle and longer duration bonds, I would rather own, I would want to own no sovereign bonds at all. United States, UK, Europe, none of it. Middle or longer term, and any part of it that's middle and longer term US treasuries or other Western sovereigns, I would replace mostly with gold and with a little 1 to 2% sweetener of Bitcoin, because the volatility is so high. And then I wouldn't change anything else, because that is, I think, the issue. The bubble this time is the bonds. I think we're in early days of a very extended period of significantly negative, sustained real interest rates for bonds. Bonds are going to lose purchasing power. So that's how I would think about it as a state investor.
I've got one more follow-up then if nobody else has questions. So one of the things that really drove me looking down this road, I sat on the Rev Tax Committee, and we would get the same groups coming back year after year asking for an increase in the percentage of whatever the tax was to cover the cost, because the percentage was not covering whatever that was meant to cover, right? Inflation was eating it up. It wasn't spending as far. What does that inflation look like in just layman's terms? What do you think we're looking at in terms of inflation, the spend for school books, for asphalt, for, you know, whatever hard materials we're looking at over the next 5 to 10 years? What does that look like?
I would answer it 2 ways. I don't know. Some of it depends on the assumptions you want to make. I'll answer it 2 ways to give you a framework to think about, and then it gives you some of the ideas, some of the levers of how I'm thinking about them, and so you can look at them from your situation. So I think an easy way to think about it is if you look at the U.S. federal debt growth over the since the great financial crisis, U.S. federal debt has grown on average, compounded annually, 8%. That's probably a decent. So you would need, if you want to get debt down, when you hear financial policymakers say, well, we need to do financial repression to reduce the debt to GDP, and we'll do it over some period of time, and it'll all work out okay. Ray Dalio's beautiful deleveraging. Well, if your debt's growing 8%, you have to have inflation that is running pretty high just to offset that debt growth, and then pay a coupon below the debt growth and the inflation rate to get there. So that's number one. The longer answer is, I did a report back in for clients back in April of 2021. So in August of 2019, the BlackRock Investment Institute did a white paper with Stan Fischer, who was IMF Fed vice chair, this head of the former head of the Swiss National Bank, Philip Hildebrand, and Jean Boivin from the former Bank of Canada governor. And the point of the papers was, in the next crisis, we don't have any, the central banks are out of room. We're going to stimulate with fiscal deficits, and then central banks are just going to cap rates, and that's how we're going to get out of this. And so we have the COVID crisis 7 months later, and it's exactly what they started to do, okay? April 21, they do another stimmy package that I didn't really think they needed. It didn't seem to make sense, except using the lens of this BlackRock white paper, which was, we're going to have the Fed cap rates and we're going to run deficits and we're going to inflate our way out of this. At that time, I said, debt to GDP is 120% in the United States. The last time the Fed was able to raise rates without breaking the treasury market was when debt to GDP was 70 to 80% of GDP, or debt was 70 to 80% of GDP. So we need to get that from 120% to 70% of GDP, or 50 points. Okay. The last time US debt to GDP was as high as it was in 2021 was in 1945, after we got done fighting a world war. It was 110% of GDP. From 46 to 51, 5 years, the US was able to get debt to GDP from 110% to 55%, roughly 50 points. And they did that by having interest rates be way below. The Fed basically capped bond yields, and inflation was at about 15% a couple times. So I said, let's assume we take debt to GDP from 120% to 70% in 2021. Let's say we do it over 5 years. Let's say debt keeps growing at 8% per year, like I just alluded to earlier. What is the negative real interest rate that we would have to experience to square that circle? What's the plug number? The plug number was US real rates would have to be negative 12 to negative 15%. In other words, inflation would need to be 15 and rates would have to be 3, or inflation would have to be 18 and rates would be 3. That gives you a sense for the level of how bad the situation is. And obviously that would be I don't even know how they could sustain that. And oh, by the way, the negative 12 to 15% real rates was over a 3 to 5 year period. So you would have to have 12 to 15% inflation minimum in the United States for 3 to 5 years to get out of this. And that assumes you can sort of, if you don't have a productivity miracle. So those are the two ways of thinking about it that I can frame up. The short answer is secularly high inflation for longer than people think at this point.
Joseph has his hand up.
Thank you. Yeah, thank you, Christian. Christian had to run. And want to be sensitive to everybody's time. We are at the top of the hour. And if you do need to go, feel free to go. Joe, do you want to ask your question?
Yeah, I think number one, thanks again for allowing me to sit in on the session today. It's been fascinating, very consistent with a lot of what we talked to. And I think as opposed to asking a question, I think I can offer up three things that might be of use to the committee and the people who are participating here today. The first is, to Luke's point, regarding how you should be thinking about an allocation of gold. We produce regularly and have worked with other states, Alaska, Ohio, Texas, in various forms. We produce a simplified case for gold, which talks about the return profile of gold long-term, the diversification benefits you get, the correlation types of behavior, plus its liquidity benefits that go into a portfolio. Using hypothetical portfolios, we can demonstrate to you how your returns, your drawdown risk, your risk-adjusted returns can be improved by adding an allocation to gold. And we can help you even refine that further. So I'm going to send off that case for gold and allow that to kind of marinate a bit, and then think about how we want to look to help you with that portfolio. Second, on the central banks, we release an annual survey on central banks. We have, for the last 3 years, had over 60 central banks that have completed the survey annually with us, and they have indicated over the next 5 years that they will be reducing their dollar exposure, they will be reducing their euro exposure, I think the challenge that I'd love to talk more with Kevin about would be what's the alternative to the dollar? I think gold's definitely filling a role in that. Our report is going to be out in the next 2 weeks. I'd love to have that sent through. Use that information to get a better understanding of how these 14 years of trend that we've seen with the emerging market, particularly central banks have been adding gold to their reserves. And then the last thing is we do a quarterly demand report, which we're absolutely happy to send to anyone that's interested in it, but also we'll take time to present it for you as a committee if you'd like it. And this will help you understand why the price of gold continues to go up. With all the facts that have been discussed, it's also this dynamic shift of not only central banks, but Eastern investors who are in their homegrown countries suffering from their own challenges. These central banks are highlighting their own concerns of their own homegrown inflationary concerns. And if you think about what's happening in China, yes, the People's Bank of China is definitely consuming significant amounts of gold, but there's also a huge move with investors who are worried about a failing property market, poorly performing equity market, an inability to buy things like Bitcoin, and knowing that their RMB is being devalued for them as well. And they're actually driving the gold price. So I think it's important, and we'd love the opportunity to show you the demand report and understanding the simplified mechanism we use to give you that understanding of the long-term price trajectory that you can get with gold. And we've got a lot more to unpack, but I thought I'd just make that comment and offer that to this group because I think those tools can be used quite quickly to help you understand.
Great, thank you, Joe. And with that, just want to be sensitive, given our time constraints. The next meeting is June 26th, at same time, same location here in the Capitol Boardroom. And we will adjourn now and hopefully see you all in June. And feel free to hang out online if you would like and continue to ask questions. And I think we'll end the recording.
Yeah, well, if we can keep going, if you're willing to stick around a little bit more, Joe, I've got a couple follow-ups on what you said. I mean, I know we're breaking and people need to leave, but so as a state, I mean, there's not a one size fits all and, you know, a hammer and everything's a nail. But what have you seen in allocations to precious metals or other things that have helped entities on the size of a state, larger entities, sovereign funds? How are they practically using things other than the dollar or other payment methods, whether it's precious metals? What are you seeing functionally practically to divert from what?
Great question. Great question. I think Luke has probably nailed it. Reducing bond exposure, adding gold to their portfolio, because even in these times that we're talking about today, bonds and equities are correlating similarly. So they're not working, and what they're doing is actually increasing risk returns on portfolios, risk-adjusted returns on portfolios. So what they're looking to do, these state-level plans, and we have had good success, but not as much success as we'd like, because many are prohibited from owning commodities, so they get stuck. So if they can move beyond the commodity bucket and get to a world where they can hedge inflation, hedge out these concerns that they have, we've seen close to the 5% allocation coming in the form of two primary instruments, one being physical gold, where they can either keep it in the London system or actually put it in a vault, homegrown vault, or wherever they might look to keep it. Or secondly, they might use a financial instrument, principally an exchange traded fund. So they deploy and they look at these levels that range from 3 to 5 is where I'd say they're normally coming in. But it is a lot of work to get them over the line. And again, that concern that we've had around commodities, it's a challenge because that's an instrument type that most plans would tend to want to stay away from in terms of holding their coffers in it. So we find ways to get that over the line with them. And that would be how I tell you we've been having these types of conversations. But again, physical gold or also financial instruments.
It's an interesting point you make too, Joe, in terms of, moving away from bonds, because then that it highlights the uniqueness of this period of time in terms of what the second derivative of that is historically people move away from bonds and the price of bonds adjusts, right? So the price falls and interest rates go up, and eventually the interest rate finds a level where, okay, I'll sell my gold back and I'll buy bonds because now I feel I'm being compensated for the risk of these sovereign instruments at whatever rate it is. And we certainly saw that in the early 80s in the United States, for example. The difference now versus the early 80s was US debt to GDP. When Volcker took rates to whatever, 15, US debt to GDP was 25%, 30%. There was no possible way that he could raise rates enough in the process of fighting inflation where he would put US solvency at risk. Now, the United States can never go insolvent, but where things get tricky for a sovereign, it's back to that gross insolvency chart, which is once the interest expense gets to be too big a percentage of receipts, the markets will start testing it. And so what I'm saying here is that why I think it's a really great outlook for gold, and I think has much longer legs than most investors realize yet, is with US debt to GDP as high as it is, the US can't raise rates. To the extent that people move away from bonds to gold, price of gold goes up, the rates go up, but rates cannot be allowed to get beyond a certain level. We've seen the treasury market begin to dysfunction when the 10-year treasury yield gets around 5%. And what's the policymaker's response? It's not stand aside and let interest expense defund defense. And hey, call the boomers and tell them, sorry, their social security check's going to bounce this month because we've got to pay China and Japan their interest. The answer is we're going to print more dollars. And so the cycle feeds on itself in a way that Americans have not seen in a long time. So I think it's a really great point to really reinforce, that you made, Joe, and add on to.
Luke, I think back on the central bank purchases that are taking place. Again, I can't emphasize enough. This is a 14-year trend. It has been significant in terms of the demand for gold. The supply and demand is what we track on a quarterly basis. A quarter of the demand is going to central banks. It has been record setting for 3 years in a row. And honestly, this is, yes, a potential issue around the weaponization of the dollar, but more importantly, what we're seeing in our survey results is that they're concerned around the US fiscal challenges. And we hear all this talk of US monetary policy, the fiscal challenges, and both presidential candidates, we know their playbooks. Most of these countries are simply saying, do we know if we have a playbook that can fix this problem?
Yeah, it's industrial policy or industrial policy, deficit financed industrial policy or deficit financed industrial policy, Trump or Biden. So I understand their discomfort.
I keep going to the well, but I find this fascinating. They call it a Minsky moment. Is that the term they use when it just collapses in on itself? Is there something like that is in the cards? What does that look like? How does this keep moving if it continues to be unsustainable, which by definition means somehow it ends? What does that look like? And what is the risk of that?
I think the risk of it's very high, but I think it's very, very important to frame it in the correct context, which is to say most market participants that I talk to and interact with are still thinking in terms of, pets.com. When's pets.com going to run out of money and, the .com bubble going to burst and all those assets are going to fall? Or when is the subprime mortgage market going to blow up? And, what's Lehman this time? And the thing that is different this time, you go back 2000, we had a stock bubble, it burst. And instead of suffering the consequences, we would have had a deflation, had to work through it, etc. We kicked the problem upstairs. We created a housing bubble to paper over the demand lost from the decline in tech equities. That bubble popped. And again, instead of suffering the consequences and working through them, we kicked the problem upstairs to the sovereign. The United States government and other Western and global governments basically backstopped a lot of the global financial system, which is fine. but that means the bubble is now in the sovereign debt area. But Pets.com couldn't print dollars. Lehman couldn't print dollars. The subprime mortgage market couldn't print dollars. The United States government can and highly likely will, when faced with the choice of, hey, bring half the Defense Department home from Eurasia and cede the Middle East and important strategic regions of the world to China and Russia, and tell the baby boomers, sorry, or print the money, they're going to print the money. You know, people say, well, we just need to cut spending. I've done the analysis. The United States at full employment is running 7% of GDP deficits. I have run an analysis where you say, okay, let's just get back to 3% of GDP at full employment, which would still be extraordinarily high. We need to cut 4 points of GDP. Remember the chart I showed. The only thing we're really spending money on are entitlements, defense, and interest. So if we're not going to cut interest, the only things you can cut that are big enough to really cut are entitlements and defense. To get 4 points of GDP out of those two line items, you would have to cut entitlements and defense by 25 to 30% tomorrow permanently. Politically, it would be suicide for starters, but more importantly, for sake of this discussion, in the great financial crisis, US GDP fell 3% on a full year basis. That 3% decline in GDP was enough to nearly crash the entire financial system, nearly collapsed it. We're talking about cutting 4 points of GDP by doing this. GDP would fall 4 points immediately. The odds would be extremely high that by cutting 4 points of GDP to make the deficit sustainable, to take it from 7% of GDP to 3% of GDP, would probably actually result in the deficit going from 7 to 12, because we would go into a severe economic recession and deficits rise anywhere from 600 to 800 basis points peak to trough in a recession. So it really highlights, you know, Joe, your point with the central banks saying they're concerned about the fiscal situation. Unless there's a miracle where like we come up with nuclear fusion by like Christmas, or AI rolls out at just the right pace so that we get more productivity, but we don't have higher unemployment as a result of it, or, you know, the Martians come in and decide, hey, we want to buy up all the treasury bonds at negative real interest rates. Like, if those things don't happen, I think gold is acting the way it's acting because the markets are starting to realize there's no, like, inflation, and high rates of inflation for longer than people think is the only way out. The dollar has to be weakened significantly.
Fascinating. So grateful for everyone that has come. I guess we have a lot to digest going forward on how to solve all of this. And Sophia, we'll look to you to just take your magic wand and figure out how we work through. Thank you all for the time, and thank you for the presentation. Joe, take you up on your offer, and Luke to follow up on the things that you've shared. And hopefully we can be a test case for states as you're out doing the work that you do on how do we navigate this as wisely as possible. And grateful for your input as we try to do that.
Thank you very much. Look forward to it.
A couple of comments.
Thank you.
Thanks, guys.
Thank you.
In 1929, this was worth $20, and this was worth $20.
Okay.
And if your great grandfather left you 20 of these, which would you prefer to have? 20 of these or 20 of these? Right? This is just an idea of purchasing power in a relatively stable period in which the debt to GDP ratio wasn't terrible. This is an example from Weimar, Germany, which was mentioned by Luke. It's 1 million mark. My grandmother left me this, and it's not worth anything. They didn't even have the ink to produce on the back of it. And this, by the way, is a Reserve Bank of Zimbabwe note from this is 2008 or 2008, $100 trillion note. They weren't the reserve currency of the world, but I will tell you, in 2008, when our stock markets were collapsing, the #1 performing stock market in the world was Zimbabwe, because people were so desperate to get out of a failing currency, they would buy anything on the stock market, and they bid it up to records. But the reason I share those is they're all stories from this book, which I brought copies of for anybody who wants a copy of it. This is my passion for helping states, Utah or Kansas or Ken attended, where we train 20 or 25 states. We're talking to your counterparts in Louisiana and South Carolina and Texas and other places, and we're beginning to get traction. But this is a treasure map that we passed out at the Texas Republican Convention. So I tried to write a very simple, non-wonky book that people could read that covered everything Luke said in as general basic terms as possible. And we've sold 10,000 of these books. It's self-published and it's going crazy. People are getting this. So I would like to offer it as a gift to anyone who wants a copy of it. And I want to tell one other thing. I am not in the gold business or the silver business. I'm in the education business. My job was to educate the Defense Department on the risks that were coming. I educate on a Blaze television program. Glenn Beck put me on Economic War Room, but I also have American Family Radio, Pirate Money Radio. I am not in, I don't make a dime. The only dime I could make from you is if I sold you a book, and I'm giving you a book if you want one. I really firmly believe the state of Utah is in a unique and powerful position, not just to deal with the Utah situation, you know, how do we protect the government of Utah? I've done a whole report on that, but also how do we protect the citizens of Utah when all of this is coming? If central banks around the world are buying gold, why shouldn't average citizens have the opportunity to buy gold and hold it and use it and spend it like money? And the founders left a provision in the Constitution to make that possible. So I appreciate you indulging me as I share this. And I see Jason Cousins on the screen. After he read this book, he flew to the United States to sit down and meet with me and say, hey, we built a technology that does this. I just wish it were here and not there. So he's traveled with me to how many states, Jason? A half dozen or Florida and everything else. And we've met with treasurers and we've met with senators and all sorts of people. This, I truly believe, is the most significant issue because you care about the people. It's about economic justice. And it was bipartisan in Texas. We had more Democrat sponsors than Republican sponsors because they care about people, not just the large economy at large. And I'm partisan. I'm a Republican, but I will tell you that Republicans all talk wonky and Democrats tell stories and Democrats show empathy and Republicans show facts and figures. And I think both of them come together beautifully in this specific instance. And so I think it's bipartisan. It's something that Americans ought to do to help Americans. Thank you.
And Kevin, thank you for enduring planes, trains, and automobiles to get here for meeting number one, and grateful you're part of this going forward. I'm so sorry the day that you've had doing that, but thanks for being there.
And thank you, Liv. Thank you, Jason. Thank you, Joe.
And then, yeah, if you'll look at the agenda going forward, and there's a lot to unpack from what we've had today, but you know, going forward, that'll be kind of the job. How do we unpack it? If you've got thoughts to kind of funnel in, and Brittany, I don't know if we can, if there's like a Google sheet or something that maybe we just ideas and thoughts we can all kind of plant in, and other questions, and this we just kind of mull this over. What does it mean for Utah? You know, it's a lot to try to soak in. So
yeah,
maybe that's a way to work on that going forward. But thank you all very, very much.
Thank you.
Thank you.
The
Thanks, everyone.
crowd.